We've all talked about natural selection as being part of evolution. We know that Darwin had something to do with it, but let's discuss, what it really is. So let's first look at these two pictures, and these are a species of moth. Which one do you think would survive? You probably would have said the darker one. And why is that? Well, probably because the darker one blends in with the environment. It's not seen by predators as easily. And you would be correct in saying that. So what happens is that this darker one's going to survive and the lighter ones are going to die out because the darker ones are able to survive and reproduce, and they're going to reproduce and pass on the traits that they have, this dark color, whereas there's going to be less and less of the light colored moths to pass on those traits, and eventually we're not going to see that trait anymore. Now this takes place over a long period of time. We're talking about millions of years. In many cases, we can talk about a mutation that creates a variation. So you have one common ancestor, and there's mutations that happen, and in this case, we end up with 3 different variations, and that's going to be in the genetic code. Well, sometimes some of those variations are unfavorable. In the case of the light and dark colored moth, in that case, the light colored moth was unfavorable, so eventually the species is going to die out because there's going to be some sort of agent that's going to select against it. And then, the remaining species may have more variation and they give rise to other, species that have different variations because of mutations and they're going to adapt to their environment. And again, any unfavorable species will die out, and those traits will die out with them. And the ones that are left will reproduce, passing on those traits. And again, you can see that the initial trait was passed on all the way through the end because it was favorable. And these are adaptations, and an adaptation in biology is a trait with a current functional role in the life history of an organism that's maintained and evolved by means of natural selection. So think of an adaptation, it's a trait, it's functional, okay? It's good for the organism to survive, and it's maintained because it's going to be passed on from generation to generation in the gametes. If we look at these finches that Darwin studied at the Galapagos Islands, we can see the same thing. They're all species of finch, but they all have different variations, and they've evolved and adapted to be able to eat different kinds of food. So these finches here that are in this part of the circle are able to eat seeds, and these are, ground finches, but some of the ground finches, this cactus ground finch up here, is actually able to eat cactus, um, as well, as having a probing bill, which kind of moves into these other types of finch. Um, and you see these other finches eat insects. So they eat varied types of food, and that's going to help decrease some of the competition so that all the species are able to survive. And for natural selection to take place according to Darwin, now again, this is a theory, and this is how Darwin came up with this. He said that there has to be an overproduction of offspring. There has to be a lot of offspring in population, okay, a lot of organisms, and limited resources. So I always like to think of Black Friday shopping. You go to a store on Black Friday and they're having a certain sale on an item. And all of these people rush into the store for that particular item, but there's more people than items on the shelves. So what happens? Well, you probably would say, well, they're going to make the news because there's going to be fights that are breaking out. Well, some of those people are going to be stronger than others or have some sort of cunning in order to be able to get those items. They have some sort of variation. And all of that's going to lead to competition because they're all trying to get the same item. Well, in nature's case, they're all trying to survive. So competition in this case is really, that fight for survival. And because there's so many organisms and there's only a certain amount of resources, those that have genetic variation that allow them to outcompete the other organisms are going to be able to survive. And we call that survival of the fittest. Being fit is, the best adapted to the environment in that case. So organisms are going to survive because they have the better genetic variation, as we saw in the previous slides. So in order for natural selection to take place, all of those things have to happen. And then those offspring will carry on that trait and pass it on from generation to generation. So that's the key. Organisms are going to be able to survive, and they're going to pass on the trait and reproduce, having more organisms with the same traits.